Hi guys, and welcome back to History Revision Success. One of the key debates in the historiography is to what extent the Weimar Republic was really challenged and threatened by the extreme left wing, or has this perhaps been over-exaggerated? So we're going to find that out today. Now, firstly, we must have a look at the problems of coalition governments and what this kind of effect had on the stability of the Weimar Republic. Because before 1914, there were a wide array of political parties representing different religions, classes, regions, and also special interest groups. But since political parties in the Reichstag had no say in the choice of government, this was not a major problem. In the Weimar Republic, though, the fragmentation of political parties was a matter of great importance, since governments needed to command a majority support in the Reichstag. And with an electoral system based on proportional representation, as we've already looked at, no one party was ever in a position to form a government by itself, and all governments, therefore, were coalitions. Now, the fragmentation of political parties became even more pronounced as German society became more divided. Moreover, many parties, both large and small, were dedicated to the overthrow of the Republic itself. And this placed an even greater burden of responsibility on the moderate centre parties, like the SPD and the Centre Party or the ZP, and also the DDP, to work together to form stable coalitions. And although the party leaders understood the need for compromise, the country faced unprecedented problems which called for tough and unpalatable decisions, which placed severe strains on coalition governments. In June 1919, for example, as we've seen, the Scheidemann cabinet resigned because it couldn't agree on the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. And similarly, in disagreements in the Fehrenbach cabinet over whether to accept the Allied ultimatum on reparations brought it down in May 1921. Another reason why it was so difficult to form stable coalitions was that in times of social, economic, and political crisis, society became much more polarized and support for the moderate parties ebbed away. The more extreme parties on the left and on the right gained support instead. And since these parties would not join coalition governments, the task of forming a government with a Reichstag majority became even harder. And this was evident after the 1920 Reichstag election. And the story of the first 4 years of the Republic was one of unstable governments and shifting coalitions. It is also a story of the changing fortunes of the SPD, because whereas in 1918 to 1919, it was the SPD that had taken the lead in establishing the Republic and trying to form stable governments, after June 1920, the SPD ceased to take a leading role in any coalition government due to its internal divisions, and sometimes didn't even participate in the ruling coalition at all. So in the period, as you can see behind me, in the period between February 1919 and November 1923, Weimar had 6 governments, the longest of which lasted just 18 months, which is a very, very short period of time. And although many of the changes in cabinets involved little more than a reshuffling of the political pack of cards, these frequent changes meant that the continuing of policy was impossible to achieve, and confidence in the whole democratic process was therefore undermined. Even its democratic supporters struggled as a result of this practical problem of creating and maintaining workable government coalitions. And overall, it was the extreme anti-democratic parties of the left wing and the right which benefited most from this disheartenment with democracy. Now behind me, you can see a statue of Spartacus. Now, if you haven't heard of him, you might have seen the film 300, in which case you may have some understanding of the legend of Spartacus. Now, he was a captive of the Roman legions and trained as a heavyweight gladiator. In 73 BC, Spartacus was among a group of gladiators plotting to escape. And the slaves defeated soldiers sent after them. They recruited other slaves into their ranks and eventually built their own stronghold atop of Mount Vesuvius. And he was one of 3 slave leaders in the Third Servile War, a major slave uprising against the Roman Republic. So what might a group named after him be fighting for? Well, in modern times, Spartacus became an icon for communists and socialists, and Marx described him as the most splendid fellow in the whole of ancient history. Now, just a quick note here about Marxism for those who are coming across it for the first time. Now, Karl Marx was a German revolutionary who expressed his ideology in 2 major books, the Communist Manifesto and Capital, in which he outlined his scientific analysis of human society. And what he claimed was that history was a continuous struggle of the classes between those who had economic and political power and those who did not. And Marxists in the 19th century were inspired by the belief that the industrial age would culminate in a revolution in which the proletariat, which means the working class, would overthrow the bourgeoisie, which means the industrial classes, by revolution and therefore create a classless society. So let's go quickly back then and remind ourselves of the events in Germany of 1918 to 1919 and see why Karl Marx's theories and ideologies are so relevant. Now, on the 9th of November 1918, Ebert creates a provisional coalition government. It's short-term until a national election was held to vote for a national constituent assembly. And it was a combination of the SPD, which are the moderate socialists, and the USPD, which were the radical socialists. Then in December 1918, the USPD split, ostensibly over the shooting of some Spartacists by soldiers, but in reality, the split was actually about the USPD's desire to introduce fundamental social and economic changes that the SPD did not want to adopt. On the 1st of January 1919, the Spartacists formally found the KPD, the German Communist Party, and they refused to participate in parliamentary elections, preferring workers' councils. On the 5th of January 1919, we have the Spartacist revolt. Now, the Spartacists aimed to overthrow the provisional government and create a Soviet republic. They occupied public buildings, called for a general strike, and formed a revolutionary committee. There were about 3 days of savage fighting in the streets that then ended with over 100 deaths, and the Spartacus revolt was put down. And then in February 1919, we have the elections for the National Constituent Assembly, which is the Weimar coalition of the SPD, the DDP, the German Democratic Party, and the ZP, the Centre Party. And as you've seen, the new Weimar government had used the army to crush the Spartacus Rising of January 1919. However, opposition was not completely suppressed, and for the next 4 years, the government faced a series of threats from the extreme left. So after the German Revolution of 1918 to 1919, the left-wing movement at first remained in a state of confusion. The moderate socialists of the German Social Democratic Party, the SPD, were committed to parliamentary democracy, whereas the communists and in the KPD, they pressed for a workers' revolution and the creation of a one-party communist state, encouraged by the 1917 Russian Revolution. The independent German Social Democratic Party, the USPD, stood for the creation of a radical socialist society, but within a democratic framework. Now, the situation became clearer when in 1920, the USPD disbanded and the vast majority of its members joined either the KPD or the SPD. So from that time, there were now 2 left-wing alternative parties, but with fundamental differences. because the KPD believed that the parliamentary democracy fell a long way short of its real aims. It wanted the revolution to proceed on Marxist lines with the creation of a one-party communist state and the restructuring of Germany both socially and economically. As a result of the 1917 Russian Revolution, many German communists were encouraged to believe that revolution would spread throughout Europe. However, the KPD's opposition to the Republic was nothing less than a complete rejection of the Weimar system. It wasn't prepared to be part of the democratic opposition or to work within the parliamentary system to bring about desired changes. The differences between the moderate and extreme left were so fundamental that there was no chance of political cooperation between them, let alone a coming together into one socialist movement. The extreme left was totally committed to a very different vision of German politics and society, whereas the moderate left was one of the pillars of Weimar democracy. So let's have a look at the revolutionary disturbances then. Well, the KPD was indeed a reasonable political force in the years 1919 to 1923. It enjoyed the support of 10 to 15% of the electorate, and there were continuous revolutionary disturbances. Protests, threats, uprisings all gave the impression that Germany was really facing a Bolshevik-inspired red threat. And red was a loose term used to describe anyone sympathetic to the left. And it originated from the Bolshevik use of the red flag in Russia, which in turn had been based on its use in the French Revolution. Now, workers were angered by economic problems and disillusioned by the lack of real gains from their revolution. In the spring of 1919, the industrial areas of Germany were racked by radical unrest. A wave of strikes occurred in the Ruhr mines, central Germany, and Berlin. The strikers demanded shorter hours, the socializations of industry, and also a government, fundamentally a government based on councils. However, the wave of protests was actually uncoordinated, with radical leaders desperately following rather than actually leading the protests. The KPD had neither strong leadership with a clear strategy, nor a tightly organized party structure as the communists did in Russia. Furthermore, it lacked support both in terms of numbers and depth of commitment. Eventually, a mixture of government promises and the use of the army and free corps quelled the unrest, with considerable loss of life in some places. The most significant disturbances, however, that we should probably focus on were Red Bavaria and the German October. So if we have a look at Red Bavaria first, which happened in March 1919. And it was only in Bavaria that the revolutionaries temporarily gained control. This didn't happen anywhere else in Germany. After the overthrow of the Bavarian monarchy, the USPD leader, Kurt Eisner, took the political lead and created a republic on the 7th of November 1918. However, he did struggle to unite the socialist parties to implement reforms and was assassinated on the 21st of February 1919. Considerable political confusion then broke out. In March 1919, a Bavarian Soviet Republic was actually proclaimed, which created Red Guards, i.e. a Red Army of workers set up by Eugen Levin, along with workers' councils and proposals for radical political and economic changes. Yet after a month, in May 1919, this was actually bloodily suppressed by the Free Corps, with over 700 killed, and a right-wing government was then firmly established in Bavaria. This event was known as the White Terror. The Whites were seen as the opponents to the Reds, and the term originated from this suppression of the Soviet Republic in Bavaria, although it did actually become a general name for all the murders and violence committed against the left by the right and by the Free Corps and by the army of 1919 to 1922. This traumatic episode in a conservative, agricultural Catholic area such as Bavaria actually shifted politics to the right wing, and it became a haven for extremists. By the summer of 1919, the best chance of establishing communism in Germany had gone, even though Marxists considered Germany the country most ripe for revolution. For the next 3 years, unrest continued, but it never seriously threatened the government's control. There were numerous strikes and demonstrations, some of which developed into attempted insurrections, especially in the key industrial areas in the Ruhr and central Germany. Workers felt that their gains from the revolution of 1918, especially the symbolic 8-hour day, were still under threat and that the revolution needed to be deepened. So if we have a look in March 1920, then you can see here behind me, we've got the January 1919 Spartacus Uprising there, and I've also mentioned the Red Bavaria of March 1919, but you can also see March 1920 in the Ruhr, because in the aftermath of the Kapp Putsch, attempts were made to exploit the fragility of the Republic to establish a more revolutionary regime. And the communists formed the Ruhr Army of 50,000 workers to oppose the putsch. It seizes control of the Ruhr in another revolutionary wave, the largest working class revolt of 1919 to 1923. Some wanted to set up a Soviet republic with workers' militia, but also protesters were split by government concessions. The army obeyed Ebert and crushed the rising with the help of some Free Corps who had been involved in the putsch. Over 1,000 workers and 250 police and soldiers were killed. The communist threat had amounted to nothing. In March 1921, in Mersburg and Halle, there was something called the March Operation, which was uprising of strikes organized by the KPD. But again, this was put down quite easily by the police. And then the German October in Saxony in the summer of 1923. Now, some looked to Russia and argued the need for a German October, a second stage revolution that would establish a true communist state. If you remember, the same thing happened in Russia. For example, in the crisis of 1923, left-wing revolutionary actions came to a head in central Germany. The KPD and SPD had formed coalitions in the regional governments of Saxony and Thuringia, but the communists went further and made military preparations for an uprising with proletarian hundreds, which were defense units. And in response, Stresemann's government acted rapidly to foil the plan for the German October Revolution. The army crushed the units and the regional governments were recreated without communists. Now, the KPD's approach has been described as a combination of foolhardiness and hesitancy. It failed to exploit the post-Kapp militancy. Then in 1921, it rushed into a poorly supported rising. It reacted to this by being overcautious during the mass protests of mid-1923, and then acted too late in October 1923. Inadequate leadership, poor organization, internal divisions, lack of support, and government repression, accompanied by minor concessions as well, meant that the revolts of 1920 to 23, just like those of 1919, ultimately failed. Nevertheless, these actions by the extreme left gave the impression that Germany was really facing a Bolshevik-inspired red threat. And as a result of right-wing propaganda, many Germans began to have exaggerated fears about the possibility of impending revolution. Yet, in hindsight, it's really clear that the extreme left posed much less of a threat to Weimar than was believed at the time. Despite all the disturbances, the revolutionary left was never really likely to seize power. And the main reasons for their failure lay in a combination of their own weaknesses and also the effective resistance of the Weimar governments. So if we look at poor coordination, even during the chaos and uncertainty of 1923, the activities of the extreme left proved incapable of mounting a unified attack on Weimar democracy. Then we have poor leadership. The repression the extreme left suffered at the hands of the Free Corps removed some of its ablest and most spirited leaders, for example, Liebknecht and Luxemburg, who were killed after the Spartacus revolt in 1919. The later leadership suffered from internal divisions and disagreements on tactics. Then concessions. The Weimar governments actually played on the differences within the extreme left by making concessions which split the left. For example, over the Cat Putsch in March 1920. And for repression, the authorities systematically repressed the rebels with considerable brutality, again referring to the White Terror. So in the end, the extreme left was just not powerful enough to lead a revolution against the Weimar Republic. However, whilst none of these individually threatened to overthrow the Republic, the Red Threat did actually turn many voters, particularly the middle classes, towards right-wing groups. And it is this that we can then note as the most immediate and real danger and menace.